Her local work is complemented by the international advocacy work, including participation in several UN forums and a testimony before US Congress on the climate issue and its links to issues of health, identity, and well-being on tribal lands. And we're also joined by Jamia Wilson, who I'm sure you remember as one of our great plenary speakers this morning. Jamia is a feminist activist, writer, and speaker. As the former director of the feminist press at City University of New York and the former VP of programs at the Women's Media Center, Jamia has been a leading voice on women's rights issues for over a decade. Her work has appeared in numerous outlets, including the New York Times, The Today Show, CNN, Elle, BBC, Rookie, Refinery 29, Glamour, Teen Vogue, and The Washington Post. She is the author of the book, This Book is Feminist, Young, Gifted, and Black, The Introduction and Oral History, and Together We Rise, Behind the Scenes at the Protest Heard Around the World, Step into Your Power, 23 Lessons on How to Live Your Best Life, Big Ideas for Young Thinkers, ABCs of AOC, and the co-author of Roadmap for Revolutionaries, Resistance, Advocacy, and Activism for All. Additionally, she joined Random House as vice president and executive editor in 2021. And leading our conversation today will be Leah Aldridge, who is my colleague at Valor US. Leah's relationship with Valor US began as a Women of Color caucus member in the early 1990s while working at local member rape crisis center program. A longtime supporter of the coalition, Leah would eventually serve as a board member and consultant before joining the staff as program manager in 2016. She is an educator, facilitator, and trainer on the multidisciplinary issues of interpersonal violence for diverse populations. Media and policy advocacy are among Leah's additional skills, having consulted on numerous media projects, videos, and campaigns. She co-authored Women of Color Leadership, a look at the experiences of women of color executives in the anti-violence against women's movement for the Women of Color Network, funded by Miss Foundation in 2013, and was the consultant and co-author of Valor Report Advancement, Building Linkages Between Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault. Leah is an assistant professor of film studies at Chapman University and holds a PhD in cinema and media from the University of Southern California. And Leah, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
I thank you so much for that introduction, Sarah. That was kind of awesome. I just want to pause for a second. I'm thinking that maybe we're having technical difficulties with Spanish language translation. So I just want to check in to see if we've resolved that, if we're close to resolving it, and what else we need to do in order to make it available for folks. Because I'm seeing people in the chat comment about that. Any ideas on what we do? Do we keep going? Do we wait? All right, we'll work on it and we'll just proceed because, yeah. So first, just to start off, I want to give thanks for just to let folks know who are for the Spanish language translation. We are working on that. So please, thank you for your grace and your patience. Just want to acknowledge where we are in this moment in time, both mentally, physically, spiritually, geographically, the land that we are on, the technology that we are using, the language that we are using, and acknowledge, spirit and labor that allowed us to gather here today. I think it's kind of nice that we kind of center ourselves together collectively in this space. I also want to acknowledge that we have, oh, yay, we have Spanish translation that is now working. So yay, thank you. Thank you for that, for people troubleshooting that. I also want to acknowledge, why we're meeting together online here today is because of this deadly pandemic called COVID, and it is caused a lot of, it's showed us a lot of things about ourselves in the last 18 months, both locally and globally. This is a collective global issue that is causing collective global trauma around the globe. And well, I said global. And I want us to think for a moment or meditate for a moment on this idea of trauma. Many of us are advocates and do this work, and we realize the impact that trauma has on people. One of the things that I want to point to is this idea of disconnection, that trauma causes a break, it causes disconnect, it causes individuals to separate from themselves in many different ways. It can cause breakage, separation in families, among friends, among partners, and within people's selves, right? And so we as we proceed through our session today, one of the themes that I'm hoping people will pick up on is this idea of making connections, right? We want to make connections. And with that, we're talking specifically about how we make connections in our social movements and across our various social movements. We understand that many of us come to our activism through our own injury, through our own trauma, through our own pain. We recognize that. We see our values, we see our beliefs, and we see ourselves in our activism and in the places where we put our time and our energy in trying to make the world a better place, right? It's important, as we think about this other concept, this allyship concept, that we see ourselves in other movements that we are not primarily drawn to. We see ourselves located in other actions, in other concerns, because none of us are free until all of us are free, right? So in 2021, that was this year, holy mackerel, Valor US, every year Valor US puts together what we call a sexual assault awareness month toolkit. And we revisited a theme that we had advanced in 2017, and we more centralized this idea of bringing movements together. We wanted to advance this idea and promote this idea of having people work in solidarity across movements. We know that sexual violence knows no boundaries. We know that sexual violence can impact any and everyone. We know that there are survivors who operate within, this was our toolkit. It is, by the way, available on the Valor website. Shameless plug, you'll forgive me for that. This was our effort in jumpstarting the conversation, right? We wanted to jumpstart the conversation. And in the course of doing that, we identified, this was just a starting point. I want to be really clear that these were the areas in which we started, where we asked people, what are the connections between racial justice and the anti-sexual violence movement? We wanted people to think more closely about the connections between disability justice and the anti-sexual violence movement. We asked people to think critically about what are the connections between the LGBTQ plus equity and justice movements and anti-sexual violence, health equity, immigrant justice, and economic justice, and alternatives to criminalization. We realize that thinking about the totality of the world can be overwhelming. And we really want people to do what they can, when they can, where they can, right? But it is important that we realize that disconnect, right, is part of a larger, I want to say, Lydia spoke about this earlier about, and Jamia spoke about this earlier about histories of colonialism, this expansion of capitalism, and so on, that creates disconnect from ourselves, our people, our culture, our lands across the globe. We have 500 plus years of trauma associated with that disconnect. And folks know that if we join together in solidarity, we can reconnect with ourselves, our souls, our spirits, and one another. And the connecting part is what promotes healing and wholeness for all of us, right? So I'm really hoping that this morning's conversation will be a very scintillating conversation. We have, again, it's meant to be provocative and to get people thinking about how do I connect with these other concerns? How do I, and how do we include, how do we call people in and educate one another and understand that my fight is your fight is my fight, right? How do we do that? We're gonna move from the global to the local because these issues are all interconnected, right? And I'd like to start with Asab Ahmed, who is a fantastic person, and I have really enjoyed getting to know Asab, and I know that that we will all be wowed by what she has to share with us today. So, Asab.
Thanks, Leah. Thanks for the great introduction and for setting us up for this conversation. Really glad to be part of this this conversation with Valor about how we can connect with one another across movements and leverage the power of movements to create change for ourselves and our communities. So let me just share my screen. Give me a second. All right, can you all see my screen? Yeah, okay. I'll just make this into, there we go. All right, so yeah, as Leah had said, I'm going to be talking sort of globally about, in particular, the climate crisis and what that means for women's health and well-being. The climate crisis is, and particularly about thinking about climate justice, is not something that immediately comes to mind when you think about women's health and like also the anti-sexual violence movement. But you know, as we're grappling with the reality of climate change that is going to impact our economy, our health, our way of life, we're beginning to kind of untangle what that actually is going to look like when it comes to our everyday lives. You know, climate change is often discussed as a threat multiplier. So that means that it's going to exacerbate existing factors that already place women and girls at a disadvantage when it comes to, or place them in a situation at which they are at greater risk. And so when we think about, you know, all the facets of women's lives, thinking about how climate will impact that is going to be incredibly important in the you know, months and years to come. So I'm just going to move to the next slide. So, you know, I'm going to try to keep this short. I can talk about this for days and days, but the agenda and kind of what we're going to cover is looking at climate change and its forecasted impacts. We'll also look at the effect that climate change is going to have on women's health and well-being according to literature, as well as some of the work that advocates are trying to kind of prioritize and highlight. And we can also talk a bit about potential solutions, and I'll finish up with some resources in case you want to learn more. So I'd like to start with, again, what are we dealing with? What is going to happen as we deal with climate change? And of course, one of the first impacts that we all think about is higher temperatures. So in general, scientists have forecast that our globe, our planet is going to get anywhere from 3.5 to 8 degrees hotter by the end of the century. Now, exposure to heat obviously has huge implications when it comes to our health, and it also will impact downstream will impact our access to resources, to our security within our communities. For instance, when you think about exposure to heat as this map, and this is domestic focus, of course, but you know, if you think about the globe, heat will be experienced differently as well. You notice that in the southern United States, as well as in the Southwest, heat is going to, the change in temperature is going to be experienced at a greater rate than other parts of the country. And when you think about the communities that live in this part of the country, particularly Black and Hispanic people, them being exposed to greater changes in temperature will mean that they are going to have to grapple with climate change in a way that others will not. And it's very important to think about this disproportionate effect, you know, when it's compounded on top of other injustices that people of color face. In addition to extreme heat, air pollution is another factor that that a lot of people have been talking about recently when it comes to climate change. 4 in 10 US residents, that's about 135 million people, live in counties with unhealthy levels of air pollution. And again, when you think about the way that air pollution is, exposure to air pollution rather, that also does differ by income level, by geography, by race. And so I always like to think, as I say, about sort of the equity of this. How do we ensure that that when we are introducing solutions and developing solutions, that we are striving for equity and not equitably just applying these solutions, since they will not result in fair outcomes. Yeah, so I think that is all I'll say about air pollution. Again, I could talk for much longer about it. Finally, this map I have here shows flooding plains within the U.S. Once again, as we deal more with climate change, we will be experiencing greater levels of flooding, particularly around the coastal United States. This will also be accompanied by drought in parts of the United States as well. And so again, thinking about how that impacts us on an individual health level as well as at a community level is incredibly important as we start to think about how to tackle climate change. So a lot of doom and gloom. It's a challenge, but I think that it's important to think about how these realities will impact us, and then, like I said, to think about solutions that can come out of that. And so I usually, as Sarah had opened with my introduction, I am a reproductive justice advocate. That's the place that I come from. I always like to start with this quote about reproductive justice, which is coined by Sister Song, which is, "Reproductive justice is the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, have children, not have children, and parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities." And reproductive justice at its core is about how we can marry together the reproductive rights movement and issues around access to healthcare, to reproductive healthcare, such as birth control and abortion, with people's lived experiences. When you think about where someone lives, their race, their income, that will all impact their ability to access the resources and the care that they need to have that bodily autonomy. And I think that is a very, very critical lens to bring to all of our conversations. There's not a one-size-fits-all solution to any of this. And I think that if we can think about social justice frameworks, which is what this conversation is about, and how they connect to the work that we're individually doing in our own movements, it can only strengthen the solutions that we develop. So again, this can be a book. I mean, the number of ways that climate change does impact women's health and well-being. But I'll start with increased rates of sexual violence against women. Following natural disasters, and often as a result of displacement, women are at increased risk of experiencing domestic violence and sexual assault. The UN Refugee Agency found that this may be due to a lack of access to safe shelter or overcrowded facilities, increased civil unrest following some of these natural disasters, or just in the absence of support systems. And so, when we think about, for instance, Hurricane Katrina, there were spikes in incidents of sexual violence following that natural disaster because women were placed in the Superdome. There was less, they were taken away from their families, and so they did not have that support system. They were exposed to all sorts of risks that put them in a much more vulnerable position. And so, this is, again, something that we need to think about as we move forward in dealing with climate change. I'll also say, following Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, there were reports of increased rates of domestic violence as well. So this is, I'm mentioning US examples, but this is something that globally is a problem. Moving on to barriers to accessing family planning services and abortion care. Similarly, there has been literature that has shown that women have more difficulty in accessing family planning services following a natural disaster. After Hurricane Ike, researchers found that Black women in particular had difficulty accessing contraceptive care, and that has consequences when we think about unintended pregnancies and being able to plan out, your family. Maternal health outcomes. Now, this is something that has, as a general matter, maternal health has gained a lot of attention in recent years as we think about the maternal health crisis. There's also been more of a connection made between maternal health and climate change. In fact, Lauren Underwood, she's a representative in the US Congress from Illinois, introduced as part of a broader Momnibus, which is a large legislative package focused on maternal health, introduced a bill that would ensure that women in climate affected areas, particularly Black, pregnant, and postpartum women, have access to the resources they need to handle the effects of climate change. Studies have shown that pregnant people that are exposed to extreme heat and to air pollution have negative health outcomes. There's a study that looked at the closure of a California coal power plant, and 10 years after that power plant closed, there was a 27% reduction in the rate of preterm births. And so you can see a direct connection between exposure to air pollution and preterm birth. This is just one example. There are many examples of the negative effects of air pollution, extreme heat, as well as flooding as well on maternal health outcomes. And I'll just quickly go over obviously they're important, but I want to get to solutions. Worsened mental health outcomes and poor menstrual health and hygiene. In the face of climate change, natural disasters, and other downstream impacts, women do experience higher rates of negative mental health outcomes, including PTSD, anxiety, and depression. There also is an effect on menstrual health and hygiene and being less able to access the resources and clean water that women need to, and girls need to take care of their menstrual health. So there's a lot of impacts here, but moving on to solutions. As I mentioned, the bill that I mentioned, introduced by Representative Lauren Underwood, the Protecting Moms and Babies Against Climate Change Act, is one of the first federal bills that really draws a clear connection between the impact of climate change and maternal health. The bill would establish climate change risk zones, which would be areas where women who are at higher risk of experiencing climate change. And so that would be higher levels of higher temperatures, high levels of air pollution, would be linked to resources in their communities, particularly through community-based organizations, to ensure that they receive support so that they are not experiencing some of these negative health outcomes that I mentioned. The bill would also create a federal interagency consortium so that the federal government can tap into the best minds across agencies and develop solutions. And it would also provide grants to state and local entities that would provide the support to women in their communities. A few other solutions that I think are worth mentioning. I did talk about targeting resources to vulnerable people in these climate affected areas. Improving the quality and resiliency of housing and local infrastructure is very important as well. Thinking about weatherization, as well as support in accessing housing, making sure that housing is affordable. It's also important that we increase funding to community-based organizations who are working on the front lines. And this goes across several areas. It includes maternal health, it includes anti-sexual violence work, ensuring that women who are at increased risk because of climate change, that they have access to help is going to be critical. And the people that often meet that need are those who work in community-based organizations. And so I'm ensuring that there's increased funding as it relates to dealing with climate change is going to be very important. Investing in telehealth infrastructure, so increasing broadband and wireless access is critical too. So people don't have to go out to seek care, to seek support, that they're able to get the help that they need within their homes or within any environment that is safe and doesn't put them at any undue, doesn't create any undue risk. And then I'll just quickly say improving access to family planning services. There's many ways that this can be done, as well as increasing funding to improve data collection so we can understand exactly how these impacts are being felt state by state and by locality. So yeah, I will just end with some resources if you're interested in learning more. I also included my email since I know this was a kind of quick overview, but just to reiterate, it is so important that we think about these different social movements, thinking about the climate justice movement. I know Candy's going to be talking about the environmental justice movement, and to think about how we can work with people across these movements to ensure that women are able to lead healthy lives and that they are that they don't have to deal with issues that put them at any kind of risk. That we can ensure that they are protected and safe. So yeah, so I'll end there and turn it back over to Leah.
Thank you, Asa. We have one question, and I'm actually thinking that we'll hold questions till everyone has spoken. But if you could just put on your radar questions regarding food politics in relationship to climate change, how food is going to be impacted by this, and particularly around looking at communities of color, Black and Brown folks, and globally, what because that's going to be a thing, a global thing as well. I mean, we're already seeing that happening. Yes, it's 108 degrees in Phoenix. Yeah, but climate change isn't real. I'm sorry. I couldn't resist. Okay. Next, I would like to go to, we started kind of thinking globally about like the weather and the planet and the way it's going to impact people and their lives. Next, we will turn to Candy White, who is going to ask us to think about the connections, right, between environment and looking particularly with, I think, Asif, you're still sharing your screen. You might want to stop share. There you go, I think. There you go, fabulous. So Candy, take it away.
Thank you so much. And I was just going to mention the screen share thing as well, so I could share my screen. Dosha Maraguets, Marishima Ishuia Hets. So in my Heratsa language, I said, hello relatives. My name is Eagle Woman. My English name is Candy White, my married name. And I have been working on issues that I want to share with you for a long time, because I guess it was something I was born into. When I was younger, I didn't really know what environmental justice was or climate justice was, or how all of these different things are connected and related. And so my perspective is going to be through, my lens that I see that I'm going to share with you here today. As I talk about history, it was mentioned in the beginning about colonization and colonialism and how we've been dealing with negative impacts. And as an Indigenous woman, been dealing with it, in my history for over 500 years. And what I want to share is that connection between the violence against the earth and violence against women. So, little perspective, I grew up on a little reservation in North Dakota, now known as the Fort Berthold Reservation. You can see in the picture here, it's located right on the heart of what is known as Lake Sakakawea. And our women were traditional farmers. We grew corn, squash, and beans, and we had very major and important roles in our households. In fact, we built our households. Traditionally, we used to live in earth lodge villages, and it was the women who built and owned the homes. And perhaps one of the most important things that we did and continue to do as women today is be the givers, the bearers of life. And in that is our connection to water. That's why we say Mini Wachoni, water is life, because literally it is the first life that every single one of us is born into. But the threat that we've been facing for a while now, basically since the Industrial Revolution and the extraction of fossil fuels, particularly at home where I'm from, is first coal and now oil and gas, and the extraction of these resources. Ours is called the Bakken Shale Formation, as you can see here, how big it is. In terms of where I'm from, Fort Berthold, we're right in the middle of what they call the sweet spot of this formation. And as a result, what we've seen is produced water, which is toxic water, being spilled directly onto our roads and highways at home on the reservation with no oversight, no jurisdiction as to why this is happening, where this is happening, and stopping it from happening. And so these spills that are happening on a daily basis, you can see the one in the foreground here, are going right into the Lake Sakakawea. These spills are toxic. Anything that this water, which they often call salt water, touches, kills whatever it touches. As you can see this here, the grass is dead, and it's still to this day, 6 years later, not suitable for anything, this soil here. And so as the spills occur, they get into our water, they put out some sandbags to help us. Well, that doesn't help anything because the water becomes toxic. This is water taken from Lake Sakakawea by my sister who was swimming in it. It was a blue-green algae bloom, and those have been happening all the time now, ever since fracking. This water was taken a mile from our intake plant where we get our drinking water from. Ceremonially and culturally, we also have areas that are now closed off to us as women. My grandma used to go and fast on this hill and pick wild berries and pick turnips, and is now has been told, she has now passed on, rest in peace, grandma, but has been told, you can no longer go here. You can no longer do these ceremonial cultural things. Where we live in North Dakota, we're the breadbasket of the country. So a lot of food comes from us, but our fields are being now put into production for the use in the oil and gas industry. And those fields are being contaminated. The water is being contaminated. The soil is being contaminated. Somebody had asked a question earlier about food justice. Well, this is an exact example of injustices. This contamination doesn't stay here. Wherever this food goes, wherever this water goes, wherever the air goes, in fact, is also being contaminated. We're eating these things that are being contaminated. There are environmental impacts that I'm sharing, but there are also social impacts that I'm going to be sharing. The infrastructure being totally deteriorated by all these trucks that just come in and literally run everything over, killing people that are out for a jog in the morning, killing my friend in 2008. Cassie was killed by one of these trucks. There's no justice for us when these things happen. And these are like side effects, impacts of the industry. As I talked about air, we have this fracking and this flaring happening. I don't know if anyone's been to North Dakota before, but this is what it looks like on the ground in my community when you stand there and look out at the pictures. This picture is not lights like you see in the cities. This picture is actually from the flares. These are fires that you can see from outer space, from these fires on the ground that we're seeing. So obviously that impacts our air quality as well. It's horrific to have to breathe in this air. So how is this all connected? Well, what we see again is that violence against the earth perpetuates violence against women. It is violence against women because we say Mother Earth, because she provides us everything we need to survive, and we're poisoning it. We have seen detrimental effects to women in a lot of studies. We have seen low birth weights, we've seen miscarriages. I myself, my sister, my cousins have all been through miscarriages, some 2, 3, 4, 5 miscarriages living in close proximity to the oil and gas industry. So this is not a coincidence. They're starting to do more and more studies that you can go ahead and research yourself to see the impacts against women. As it was just talked about, by OSA prior to me, these conditions that were put in on the ground lead to an extensive amount of problems with women. And so I'm sort of zooming into some more specific problems like endocrine disruptors as a result of living in close proximity to oil and gas and to the fossil fuel industry. That means before you ever even get pregnant, you can be in danger. Your child can be in danger because of endocrine disruptors that you've been exposed to. And if you want to talk about injustices, this is a huge injustice. What we also are dealing with, working with the Indigenous Environmental Network are all these pipelines. You might have heard of Dakota Access Pipeline that we fought so hard against. Now we're fighting against this Line 3 Enbridge pipeline so hard, trying to get it to stop, because whenever this industry comes to our communities, we don't just have these environmental impacts that impact our women. We have social impacts through these horrific man camps. Thousands and thousands of men coming to places to work near our communities, which increases the violence against our women. It increases the rape against our women. It increases the sex trafficking that has been happening in our communities and against our women. On Line 3, they did another sting and found another percentage of people that are working on this pipeline that are involved in sex trafficking. And in the media, they try to cover it up and say that it's prostitution or, different things that they try to say in media blackouts to not tie the industry to this violence against women, when in fact, there is no doubt that there is a tie and a connection of that violence that we have to deal with on a daily basis, as these man camps are right near our communities. And they are substandard conditions for the men too. There was 125% increase in violence in general against women, domestic abuse, kinds of negative violence in North Dakota when this industry came. 125% increase as a result of the industry. And so I just took some local news clips that you won't see in mainstream media to share with you all to show what that feels like here. This exacerbates our problem of missing and murdered Indigenous women. It is a horrific and often unspoken thing that we're dealing with as Native people. We're being indivisibilized. We have to constantly fight to say we are still here. This is happening to us at astronomical rates. And just because we only make up 2% of the population doesn't mean that the numbers that it's happening to us in shouldn't be looked at and taken into account, because the rates are off the charts. At home, we had to look for Olivia, a friend that I went to school with that was missing for several months. And she was found in the lake, strapped into the passenger side of a truck, dead. And we still don't know what happened to her or why. In addition to that, when the industry comes, it brings things like drugs, organized crime, MS-13, heroin. And when our women like young Ashley here, who was 28 years old, get caught up in it, there aren't a lot of resources available for them. Same with Lisa. Ashley and Lisa both died as a result of heroin. Both of them had similar stories of their hands and feet turning black as their organs shut down. Lisa left behind 5 children. It's not just women. My cousin went missing in 2013 in November. We searched for him until February. He was last seen with known drug dealers. But because he was with known drug dealers, when he was found dead in the lake, his case was open and shut. He either did it to himself or for some reason deserved it. There was no justice that was brought about. And the thanks that we get for opening up our borders for all of these men to come in to these man camps and work in the industry is more racism, more violence. This was found by school children in one of our communities called Mandaree. Third graders found this on their dumpster. And so as you can see, problems are exacerbated. And what we do is we speak out, we make our voice heard to stop the violence, to speak up and organize in our communities with other women, both at a national level, bringing people from around the United States, but also at an international level, bringing people from around the world and strong Indigenous women who are going through similar problems around sexual violence, around violence against the earth, to fight and stand strong in solidarity together. Strong women like my good friend, Ruth Buffalo. If you don't know her, please look her up and please support her. She ran in Fargo, North Dakota, the most racist Republican place you could ever find, and won. Beat a man who tried to stop us as Native people from being able to vote. She beat him. And then she went and enacted all these laws, this policy. These are just the bills that she sponsored alone. This doesn't include all of the bills that she co-sponsored in the fight for women, in the fight against missing and murdered Indigenous women, against sex trafficking. So please support her, look her up. We also go to DC ourselves. If they don't want to come to our communities and our reservations and talk to us, we'll go straight to them on the front lines. And we'll take our children with us and we'll tell them to stop the rape against the land and against the water and against the women. We do what we have to do in order to build a regenerative economy. And that's what we do. And you can see these systems are all connected: food, health, environment, culture. And as the Indigenous Environmental Network, we're making those connections, and we ask you to join us in building this regenerative economy. It starts with a just transition away from the fossil fuel industry and beginning to remember where we come from collectively as humanity and what we need collectively: clean air, clean water, and clean soil, the three most important resources of all. At Haskell Indian Nations University in Lawrence, Kansas, we held a Just Transition Assembly program so that we could talk about, what does this look like for us? Well, every community is different in a transition. Ours has earth lodges, as I talked about in the beginning, where we want to rebuild infrastructure and use this infrastructure for cultural programs or what have you, to bring back some of the work we do, working with native renewables on a small scale, using other forms of energy and less energy. Going back to our traditional forms of gardening, bringing back our cultural ways, whether that be a small garden or a large garden, teaching people how to do it, to care for ourselves, teaching our women by having workshops around our traditional ways of building things, teach women how to build, make burden baskets again, traditional carrying baskets, things that we can do to empower our women who have been put in very difficult, wicked situations and might feel lost. But we have a rich history that we can draw upon. I'd ask all of you to support the Indigenous Environmental Network in the work we do around Indigenous women's feminisms. We have just wrapped up a feminist school that was several months, that had over 200 participants with women from around the world. And there will be more schools to come, and you can view all of our webinars on our website of past webinars that we've done in terms of Indigenous feminisms. And then lastly, to just continue to support Indigenous Women Rise. It's a movement that I've been a part of since 2017 with very, very powerful women. We don't necessarily have meetings all the time where we get together in a room like this, but we work together collectively on the issues we're facing on the ground as women around the United States. And we help lift each other up to rise as Indigenous women. And so I just want to say, this is all for the future generations. I got my two little kiddos here. This is my little Ayana and my little winter eagle. And, somebody has to be a voice for all those that can't speak for themselves. This includes our babies that don't have a voice yet, all the plants and animals, all of the people and places and things that we have to be strong enough to fight for if they don't have a voice for themselves. Includes abused women, battered women, women who are scared to come forward, thinking that they're alone. Well, you're not. There are a lot of us out there, and we're willing to fight for you and with you and hold you and lift you up. So with that, I will conclude by saying Matsigarad, which in my language means thank you.
Thank you so much, Candy. If you could, when you have a moment, if you could include the link to your organization in the chat, that would be great. There's like an Indigenous Women Rising, and then there's Indigenous Women. So I just want to make sure we get the one that you participate in. And thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, your experience, your heart with us. I'm hearing a lot of ways in which we can make connections so far with Usop and Candy. We've started with the global, and we've distilled down to kind of like, kind of regional, and now we're going to get with the individual and look at personals. I would like to invite Jamia Wilson back to the microphone to talk to us about connections and healing the world. Thank you, Jamia. Welcome.
Hi, thank you so much. It's been such an honor to be with each of you today and just to follow two powerful, powerful presentations. Thank you both for sharing your vision and your stories, and for just helping all of us connect the dots. So what I am hoping to do is to weave together some of what I have been thinking about the individual moments in my life that have taught me how to connect the dots, in hopes that it will inspire the rest of us to think about the things we've experienced that have taught us about how to connect the dots, because connecting the dots is natural to us. It is something that we do as small children, just like what Candy said, before we can even speak. We're observing the world around us. We have been taught to disconnect, as Leah was telling us earlier, from that truth and from the instincts of what we know. And so what I'm hoping to do is just talk a little bit about the stories that helped me connect the dots, in hopes that we can all think about how we can also use story to connect the dots when we are talking to others about why these issues are all connected. So we can move away from single issue focus and really talk about things in a holistic way, because everything is connected. And in the Indigenous tradition that Candy just talked to us so beautifully about, we're all relatives. So I think a lot about that in terms of how we've been taught to separate, and to think about that as being in connection with all of the paradigms that kill us, all the paradigms that keep us divided from one another. So I'm sharing my screen. Can you all see my screen so far?
Yes.
Great. I want to figure out, can someone help me figure out how to show this predominant slide here?
Yeah. Jamia, go to present in the right-hand corner next to share.
Okay, on
other side.
right.
Over to the right.
Oh, to the, am I right?
Keep going.
Next to
If you're looking at it, it's on the top right.
Oh, on
top right corner where it says present.
I don't know why I don't see it where I am. Let me see. I want to just try one thing. I'm not used to doing it through Google Drive, but I'm going to try to see if it'll let me.
Or go up to view.
Up to view. Perfect. Present. Voila. Thank you. Brilliant. See, when we work together, we can all get it done together. So thank you. So what I wanted to do is talk a little bit about my story and how I learned to connect the dots. So we talked a little bit this morning about how I wrote a book that came out this week. It's titled This Book is Feminist. And in that book, I originally came up with this idea that I wanted to talk about why feminism is good for all of us, and to give 15 different chapters that would talk about all of the different themes in our life, the main values, the main experiences we have that would connect together to show why feminism is good for us. And then I realized that feminism in itself is complicated. There's a lot of reasons why a lot of people don't feel comfortable using that label because of the actions of some feminists who have left people out historically, who have not moved forward in a liberatory framework that includes all of us and ensures that all of us are free and not just some. And so when I started thinking about that to create this book for the next generation, an intersectional primer, one that talks about power and explores things, I realized after getting together all the statistics I wanted to get together, all of the data, all the things to prove my points about why feminism is important and necessary to healing the world, I realized that I kept wanting to tell personal story. And I wondered, why is it that I feel the need to over-explain and over-justify what I inherently know is a movement for equity and dignity and justice, no matter what we call it. Feminism is what we're calling it. That's the umbrella, but what I know in my bones and in my core, that's what it is. And so I quickly realized in working with this with my editor that what was keeping me stuck was that I hadn't added the personal story. And so I went back to the writing table in a little bit of a weird karmic overturn because I work as an editor during the day and make other people do this. So it was kind of, that was really real. And went back to the writing table and realized, oh, what you had before, that is not it. That is a part of yourself that feels as if you can't put forth the vulnerability of your story, and instead come back with those stats, with that data, with the anecdotes, and show people how to connect with your personal story first through emotional resonance, then lead them with the personal story and how it connects to the larger story, and then give them the takeaway of the data and what they can do to create action and to share their stories and the data with others. And within that, I just realized that that would be the channel to get young people to connect, but also to not just give them answers, to say, these are the questions in which I've explored about how all of these things are connected. Before I had names like intersectionality or feminism to describe it, or justice or injustice or environmental racism. None of those things were vocabulary I had, even though I was seeing it and experiencing it. So I'll just briefly connect some of those stories with you to show how those connect, but it really came through a theme that I learned from my friend Courtney Martin during a discussion we had about her parents always teaching her to trust her own outrage. And that became a chapter in my book, of course, citing her, of course, as we always do, to say that really for me, when we identify how we connect the dots between these systemic inequities, when we connect the dots between identity and systems, that trusting our own outrage is a key and integral part of the work, and interrogating why it is that we have felt the need to, or we've been conditioned to distance ourselves from our visceral relationship to the outrage. Because when we do ask ourselves and trust ourselves about the outrage, it really gives us the answers. So this first story that connected me to trust my own outrage is this article from the Times and Democrat in 1968. It is from the Orangeburg Massacre. My mother survived the Orangeburg Massacre as one of many Black students who were shot at by law enforcement during a time of integration of a bowling alley in their college town. This was one of the biggest school shootings that's ever happened in this country, as significant as Kent State, and yet it received so little media coverage and didn't get an official monument until many years later. And this is a story that before I knew about language around gun violence, gun control, all those conversations, was a story I heard. And it was a story where I first learned about reproductive justice before I heard those words, because my mom told me a story of her friends who were shot and killed, and also some of her friends who were beaten and injured for trying to protect her other friend who was a pregnant Black woman who miscarried as a result of the brutality that day. So that is an example of thinking back of the stories that we tell our children and how we can start to create this kind of thinking and engender this kind of discourse to people of all ages as we tell our personal stories and connecting the dots. This isn't just a story about gun violence or racial injustice. Both of those things are true. It's a story of misogyny. It's a story of state violence and militarism. And all of those things are true. Many years later, my mother, who died of uterine cancer too young, said that she attributes the stress, the nightmares, and the trauma that she had after this and other experiences with police brutality and environmental racism to killing her with a rare cancer that kills women of color, and specifically Black women, at 50%, and white women with the same cancer live at almost 90% across class. So this is just another example of how we can connect those dots. The next dot I want to connect is a story that Andrea talked about earlier this morning, and it really warmed my heart. It's the story of Joanne Little, who is my paternal side cousin. And Joanne Little was someone who I grew up hearing about from my grandmother, whose name was at that time Ethel Little. She became Ethel Wilson also, which is my last name. But Joanne Little had been a very smart young woman who was a part of the foster care system. And in that system, engaged in things she needed to do to survive, was arrested for a petty crime and sexually assaulted in prison. She used deadly force against her assailant, who had locked her in the courthouse and who had a history, or locked her in the sheriff's house, and who had a history of attacking Black women, and poor Black women specifically, because he knew that the accountability was likely to be slim. And when she did use deadly force to stop him, famously using an ice pick and then going into hiding because the state of North Carolina was calling for the death penalty, she ended up being hunted and deciding that she was going to put her life in the hands of the people by taking it to court, when it was explained to her that if she were to win this case, she could change the law and make it so that victims of assault who were incarcerated could also use deadly force in self-defense. And she was acquitted as a result of an intersectional movement of grassroots movements and solidarity and prisoners' rights groups and feminist groups and the NAACP and many, many others. Angela Davis writing a really powerful piece in Ms. Magazine about it. Sweet Honey in the Rock using art to make a song about her. Joanne Little is the song. It's beautiful. And I just share that to say is that I learned about her growing up. Many years later, when the Women's March happened and I would talk about this case, I realized that a lot of people in my life hadn't heard Joanne's story, even though it was the trial of the decade, as the Chicago Tribune deemed it in 1975. And why is that? This happened before the Women's March, the largest march in recorded history, but this was an example to us of what an intersectional multi-issue movement does. And it saved her life and therefore saved the lives of many others. So this is another story that I'm so glad that it was a story that I was told as a child that helped shape my thinking and was the basis for why another story that helped shape me turned me into a feminist, which was the Clarence Thomas hearings, when I understood that I believed Anita Hill, even though there were some Black men in my family who told me that as a Black person, I could not support this woman because I needed to be more focused on getting a Black man, despite my disagreements with his values, on the bench. So I just share all of that to say that these are just some examples of how those stories connect to a lot of the words that we use to talk about systems and to talk about policies. And it's important for us to make sure that we enliven those stories, because these are often the bridges that bring people together, inspire action, and ignite movement because of empathy and emotional resonance. And Joanne's story is just one of many. Inez Garcia, another that I heard about as a result of this family story, and then later became more interested in because I didn't hear about her name or Joanne's until I went to grad school outside of my family. So now I just want to share through those examples that we have many movements that I hope to pass on to our children as examples of this exact phenomenon of how we need to connect the dots, using the language that feels right for us and our communities, beyond jargon, beyond pretension, to just make sure that the core, the root issues of dignity, human rights, and values of justice, humanity, and love, dare I say, that valor, if I may plagiarize a little bit with your word, but all of those things are things that we can teach, and we can make all of those things accessible in age-appropriate ways across generations, whether we're talking about freeing Cytonia and that movement that came from people telling the story and connecting the story, to feminists coming together to demand climate justice around the world, to ending the criminalization of DV survivors, as Nikki's still incarcerated here in New York State for defending herself against a violent partner, for sex workers who are still subjugated and undermined for their labor and stigma, but can be sexually assaulted and at high rates. And also for trans people who are disproportionately killed and targeted, who don't get the airtime and don't make the headlines and aren't talked about as much. These are stories we can start to share now. These are stories that we can move hearts and minds and policy over, as long as we trust our own outrage. So I want to thank you for having me here today, and to ask each of you to do a little homework. What are the stories you were told as children that you may think about after we've had these conversations and the presentations that have happened during this session help you connect the dots in your own way? What are the silences that haven't been discussed even here today that you know through your stories and the outrage that you trust that need to be spoken, and that only you and your family can tell in just the right way? Because those are then the stories that need to be shared. And whether your stories will be shared in a petition, on social media, around a campfire, at a speak out, at a take back the night, you want to write a book, on a podcast, whatever it is, where is it that you will unleash some truth so that someone else may be unshackled from their own? Thank you.
Wow, that was really terrific. And if I could get everyone to just, drop some applause in the chat, that would be great. Just applause, thank you, clap, clap, clap. That's kind of amazing. If you have questions for any of our panelists, Asab, Candy, or Jamia, please go ahead and feel free to drop those into the chat, and I will do my very best, my level best, to get those out there and facilitate that discussion. But I'm going to go first. As you all think about your questions, I'm going to go first. Listening to the three of you, I'm just like, oh, there's an issue, there's a justice movement for that. There's reproductive health, housing, homelessness, mental health, climate justice. Let's see, there's environmental assaults against the planet that impacts, Candy's like violence against the earth and violence against women. I was also struck by this idea about how when we disconnect from our culture, that is an act of violence, and it's a way of subjugating and oppressing people. That there are that deaths and injuries and harm that come as a result of all of these other efforts. Look at the harmed as side effects, as Candy would point out, or collateral damage. Like people are just collateral damage. As we tie these industries to violence against women, as we continue to understand that people don't live single issue lives. So we want to make these connections so that we can be multi-issue or be more holistic and comprehensive in the way in which we go about our activism. Not that people aren't already doing it, but this is a reaffirmation of that. And how telling a story can highlight all of the different either systems or concerns or issues that can impact an individual, such as Joanne Little, right? So I wanted to ask each of you, I was just so moved by, well, do any of you have any questions for each other? We get to these panels and sometimes people who are on the panels together don't necessarily get to, have conversations with each other. But do any of you have questions for each other? Or think about it? We have a question in the chat. There was a question earlier about food and what we can expect in the future in terms of climate justice, environmental justice, and food deserts, this idea of scarcity, or the way in which things are contaminated. So if anyone wants to speak to that, and then Paloma has a question. Paloma from New Jersey also has a question. Anybody?
I could start when it comes to, I think the question was around food politics. And I will say I haven't really looked into the issue of food politics, like the production, distribution of food as it relates to climate change and, so how that's impacted. But I can speak to food insecurity kind of saying the same thing, that climate change does impact people's ability to access food. It impacts food being able to produce food. And so when you think about, and particularly in the global context, when you think about how that will impact people, it particularly impacts women. Women oftentimes are the ones who are in charge of, whether it's purchasing the food or actually growing the food, right? And so when you think about the fact that food will be less accessible, it will place women in a position of having to go to greater lengths to procure it. An example I think about, and this isn't food related, but thinking about even accessing clean water or accessing firewood, right? Women oftentimes, my father's from Somalia, and so I think about women who have to travel, for longer distances to access, say, water. The longer you have to travel, the more the more at risk you are at things related to sexual violence, or it also puts your health at risk. You have to travel these long distances. Creating stresses for yourself physiologically as well as emotionally, and of course, your exposure to sexual violence. So, I know in Somalia that they're increasing droughts. Agricultural output is declining. A lot of people put their assets are their livestock. It's the agricultural and sort of domestic, the livestock. And so if you are losing out on that and you're having to go further and further to get those resources, it only will create harms for women, since women, again, like I said, are the ones who must take care of those issues. But of course, I want to turn to my other co-panelists if they want to add to that.
Well, I just wanted to quickly say that I think most people don't even understand the importance of the soil in relation to climate change. We only have like 3% of arable soil. And when that soil is being contaminated, everybody's putting that into our bodies, men, women, children, what have you. And so it's frightening. It's a very heavy burden to bear in order to try to change policies so that there is food justice in our communities. I grew up on a reservation, and in terms of us, we had commodities from the government, canned foods and sugar and flour. So there's all this diabetes that exists, and people say, oh, you just don't take care of yourselves, when in fact we had a different lifestyle. We ate good before the government forced us into not eating good and made us all become ranchers and cattlemen and have cows, and so it's decolonization, and it's a big word and people often get scared about it, but it's remembering historically how we survived without going into a grocery store. What would you do if you went into a store and there was nothing on the shelves? What would you do if you turned your tap on and no water came out? We are so reliant on the system that's been built up around us, which can crumble as a result of what we're doing to our planet. It can crumble at any moment. That's why we're trying to say, don't sit around and wait for it. Let's just start gardening. If you're in a city, put a tomato plant out in your balcony or in your window. Start looking at urban areas of gardening each block, things where we're teaching ourselves once again how to be sovereign, which means how to feed yourself and how to get water for yourself. And we have to realize that we have to push back against the United States policies, because for as much as we're seeing now, it's 10 times worse in the global South. as Osab was saying, and in other communities, they are already experiencing this and moving and migrating. And that's what's happening is climate adaptation by moving to places. And there's going to only be so many places you can move before you can't move anymore. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump into, Candy, to what you had said about our policies, right? And ensuring that, because for what it brought to mind is thinking about air pollution, right? And the fact that it's both the policies and how the policies are implemented, because we actually do have policies around air pollution levels, right? It's like, you have areas, if they're non-attainment, that they're supposed to get back into like the appropriate air pollution level, but there's still localities and states that are not. And so it's like creating policies that both incentivize our policymakers, the people who influence really our lives, to do the right thing, and also to not give them the chance to not do the right thing. It's like there has to be some sort of balance so that we're not the ones who are left holding, who are just left to suffer while they decide whether they're going to, actually abide by what the policy and the law is. There's a lot of people that live in very, very unhealthy areas, as you're saying, the soil, the water, they're not clean, and we have standards, and yet they're not being followed.
Jamia, did you want to add anything to that, or?
I just think everything that was said was so on point. The only thing I would just add is I was raised, with a family of sharecroppers, and people who still farm some of the land that they still maintain, and heard stories, as we were talking about that, of the kind of sexual harassment and sexual violence that farm workers experience, and that still goes on, and specifically migrant undocumented farm workers who have even less access to resources, and are less likely to report. So I think for me, when I think about the food, I'm thinking about who makes our food, who prepares our food, who's harvesting our food, and then also just the struggles that Black, Indigenous, and people of color farmers have had this year, in the pandemic, in the past year, that when there were resources that were being given out to farmers, there's equity issues around that, and who's getting those resources and support. So it's mainly, I'm just thinking about what can we do. There's some initiatives, and there's some grassroots funding campaigns online to help contribute to the people who are getting our food for us every day.
Oh my goodness, thank you for that. I'm thinking about, Candy, you used a term, I didn't write it down, but it reminded me of another concept that I think Asif mentioned previously, called climate gentrification, right? As people have to move, that what we're going to see is people who are in the more developed or luxurious parts of, this country, what we call the so-called United States. They're as Florida sinks, or as the California coastline erodes, those people are going to start moving more inland and displacing, folks who are living in the interior, if you will. I think that a lot of that is already happening in parts on the Hawaiian Islands, and so on. So all of these things, they are connected. I know I sound like a conspiracy theorist, but we have material evidence to demonstrate the connections between all of these. One of the participants asked a question about how do we elevate or make, Paloma's question was, how do we bring the violence against the earth, as you described it, and violence against Indigenous women more into the mainstream media and awareness? We do not hear enough about this, and Stephanie echoes and seconds that question. And I would just say that one of the ways it is by starting today with this conversation. I'm so glad that you're all here. We have 192 participants in this, and hopefully each of you will tell 3 people, and so on and so on and so on. But Candy, please, if you want to expand on that, other ways in which we can all, connect with the new Department of the Interior in Biden's cabinet if we want, or we can reach out to Ruth Buffalo if we want to think about it at the policy level. But I'm sure that there are. Do you want to introduce your baby to us, Candy?
That's that's him screaming right now. My son.
Something- They want to something. Hi, sweetie.
Hi.
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 You blow kisses.
Oh, thank you for that. Well,
Yes.
we needed that, y'all. We needed that.
So the thing is to just, for me, like you said, being a part of this conference, for example, who would have thought going to a national sexual assault conference would bring so much insight and so much connectivity? But that's what it is people understanding that all of these systems are not disparate, they're not disconnected. They're all related. And again, just visit us at ienearth.org to find out more, because we're part of a huge alliance. We're part of the It Takes Roots, which is an alliance of alliances. That includes the Climate Justice Alliance, the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, and the Right to the City Alliance, as well as us. And so it's diversity from all walks of life working on all of these issues that we've talked about here today. And we always ask people to join the movement, as it's so called, because it's being woke, really, and staying that way. It's a very heavy burden to bear when you start to get into the details of just how connected it is and just how much we need to change. But that's the only way, is by being educated and knowledgeable. That's why they say, ignorance is bliss. It really is. And so somebody asked a question in the chat, what do you all do for self-care? And that would be what I would also ask the rest of you is, what do you do for your own self-care to ensure that the work is sustainable? Because it is a heavy burden to bear. And for me, it's just being outside as much as possible, standing on bare ground and reconnecting as much as possible. An occasional bubble bath, which I sometimes feel guilty about because some people can't have that, it feels like it's almost like a waste of water, but that's what I do. That's just my level of thinking. But what do you all do?
That's such a great question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Us go.
Leah, you want to go ahead?
Oh, please. They want to hear from you all, not me. Go ahead.
That's such a good question. I would say one thing I love to do is to take care of plants. I have a lot of plants and they've brought me so much joy. And I keep on amassing them. It's just when you walk into a room and it's full of green things and, you feel like the air is cleaner in your house. And it's also the joy of watching something grow. So yeah, I love to take care of plants and also to be outside and to try to stay present in the moment too. I think talking about sustainability, to keep ourselves, sort of able to, to persevere, it's sometimes important to just think about the moment, not think about all the millions of things that need to be done for us to, reach our goals, that we can just think about where we are, practice gratitude, and just, sometimes take a moment too. So yeah, I'll pass it over to Jamia if you want to jump in.
Thanks. So yeah, I love this question. I am in constant pursuit of improving my self-care. So one of the things that I, have really tried to do now is scheduling time for it, because I'm trying to undo this need to kind of strive, do, and do more being. So I have now been really pushing myself to spend the weekend actually really taking that time for self-care, and at least for a day or two, not working. That's not always possible, but really taking seriously that space and turning off. And at least if I can have several hours or a day where I just have my phone off, do not disturb on all the devices, you cannot find me or reach me, that's very important for me, and no notifications allowed. Also, I am a big fan of magnesium and magnesium flakes. I put magnesium flakes in the bath. I'm with you too, Candy, about having my guilt about the water. So I try to, be mindful around that. But magnesium flakes, then also magnesium, just, when you add magnesium into your life through food or supplementation, it can really help with sleep and anxiety and inflammation. So when magnesium came into my life through a healer, who helped introduce me to it. It's really been a game changer. I also try to really prioritize my sleep and have strong boundaries around it. I don't know if my husband kind of loves that, because I think everyone should go to bed when I want to go to bed. But it's been game changing for me to really sleep and try to move my body in ways that make me happy. And then also to cook. And to cook for people that I love. I think that's another self-care thing. It forces you to use your hands. You can't be doing other things and cook well. So it's a practice in really needing to be present.
I love the way that cooking really forces you to be present in the moment. No multitasking and all that. So thank you for that. I'm going to ask each of you to drop a contact website link in chat once again, because we are close to time. Michael has a question. I'll do Michael's, and then, but yeah, if you could, ways in which people could find out more and get more involved. And as you progress tomorrow and reflect back on the conference, when we get all the recordings up and everything, continue to think about how do we make these connections, right? Michael stepped away, but he wants to ask, or sorry, Michael, they want to know if onslaught coming from different directions, how do we show up for each other? Or beautiful question. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful question, Michael. Wanted to be on the land as an ally at Standing Rock, wanted to be at the border supporting immigrants, wanted to be standing in allyship with local reproductive health and abortion providers, sitting on anti-sexual violence as an advocate and rep for Black family in the interest of safety for Black bodies, so many others, and I don't have the hours or the weeks. You know, I get it. I get it. Michael, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that question. How do we show up for each other? And knowing that, you know, my bubble bath is really, you know, 2 weeks away. If I got to order some magnesium flakes, I got to order some plant seeds. I got to get it. I can't order them on Amazon, so I got to find another way to get them. Yeah. So until then, how do we engage with all of this without feeling overwhelmed? And if we could let that be our closing consideration, that would be awesome. Anyone want to take the lead on responding to that? How do we show up and not be overwhelmed?
Well, I think the most important thing is a quote I heard: we rise by lifting others, but we can also only lift others when we lift ourselves too. There's an ego thing that goes on with us as humans where we think we can do it all, and geez, everything every day is so important, and we forget to look at the big picture. What ripple effect are you going to leave in another lifetime when you're gone? That's what we need to think about. And that's how we show up for each other, is not guilt tripping, you know, ourselves, and not being bought into, I guess, propaganda. There's so much propaganda out there in the world. And so if you can't physically be in a space, spiritually connecting that way through prayer, whatever prayer means to you, whoever your guide, you know, creator is, I think
it's 2:00.
Oh, my computer is saying it's 2. It's very powerful. It's very, very powerful. Just go out and put up a prayer, whether you know it or not, if you can't physically be in a space.
Nice. Also for Jamia, anything you want to add to that?
I think that's really beautiful. And, you know, I think that the prayer, what you said was such a poem, because, you know, we pray with our feet too, when we stand with one another and when we take action, when we see injustice. So I just thought that was so beautiful. The one thing I would say is, one thing I have done that, you know, some days I love it and some days I find it hard, is if you are one of the many people living in this country who don't speak another language, take time to learn another language and really commit to learning it, because so many people around the world commit to learning ours because they have to. And when you do that, it ignites empathy, and it also helps you be in more solidarity and in more communities. So, you know, I actively have been studying Italian and French since I was about 8, and I'm not perfect by any means, but it has helped me expand my world. So I just think that that's one thing we can do, and Spanish is next on my list.
Right on.
I know we're at time, so I'll just say very quickly, kind of building off of what Candy and Jamia had said. Yeah, I think creating safe spaces. I mean, I constantly think about how, there's just so much pressure on us to get this work done. Like I said, I mean, I sometimes I'm not grounded in the present. I'll say most of the time, I'm usually thinking about the million other things I have to do. And also, sometimes the interactions you have with people as you're doing that work can grate on you. I mean, there's lots of microaggressions that happen in work, particularly for women of color, and it's a lot to take on day after day. And so I think when I'm able to connect with someone who I know professionally, but I also know is someone who's a good person and who creates that sort of safe space for me where I can fully be myself, talk about how I'm feeling, and just feel like I'm being seen. That creates this sort of peace within me, so I can, go on and continue doing the work. So yeah, safe spaces and just being there for each other.
Awesome. With that, I would just leave you all with make a connection, make some connections, and we can heal each other and the planet. Thank you everyone for your participation and your questions. I want to thank the interpreters, both ASL and Spanish language. I want to thank the tech crew, Marcella and Sarah and Shelby. And finally, the participants, thank you all of you for listening and taking it all in. And then for our wonderful speakers who shared their stories, their experience, and they trusted us with their lived experience here today. And we promise that we will hold it with great value. Everyone have a great rest of the day and be well and be healthy and be safe. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.